That's our goal. Yes,
Right.
we're in negotiation with them right now.
Right. Great. Thank you. All right. Anything further on ethics, members? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time. Appreciate your being here. Next up, we're going to go ahead and call up the Coalition of City Unions to make their presentation. And I want to apologize for not having been here earlier. As Mr. Englander said, we had some very unexpected, tragic situations that we had to deal with this morning. One thing I've learned is that you have to expect the unexpected in city government, and it always seems to come at exactly the worst thing happens at the worst time. So my apologies. I appreciate your patience and your flexibility. Delighted to be able to welcome the Coalition of City Unions to make their presentation. This is something we began during the first budget that I oversaw as chair of the Budget Committee. I don't believe before that the city unions had ever had a literal seat at the table during budget hearings, and I'm delighted to offer you the opportunity to fully participate in this process. So who's going to take the lead in beginning this? Ms. Parisi, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So this morning we are going to take this very welcome opportunity to share with you our best thoughts about a balanced plan to fix Los Angeles. We're here in two capacities. In our traditional role on behalf of the Coalition of LA City Unions, which represents 22,000 of the city's civilian workforce, and also as members of the recently formed broader-based community coalition called Fix LA. Together, we endorse a sensible approach to budgeting built around three simple guiding principles. Number one, maximize revenues before making cuts. Number two, make restoring neighborhood services to pre-recession levels a priority. And number three, work to provide good jobs for all Angelenos. We have divided our presentation into several sections. We begin with a brief review of the sacrifices that our members have made to help taxpayers cope with the economic hard times brought on when unchecked Wall Street greed crashed the economy in 2008. We will then illustrate the type and magnitude of service cuts that have harmed the quality of life in many neighborhoods and, if left unchecked, threaten to undermine the city's reputation as a highly desirable place to live and work. We will offer our analysis of city government's current financial state with recommendations on how to improve it, both short and long term. Then we will offer an analysis, sadly, because of a lack of transparency, that we believe is a first. It discloses eye-popping sums that city taxpayers pay to Wall Street firms. In a single year, we have painstakingly reconstructed. We estimate that taxpayers spent more than $300 million on these fees, which do not include payments for principal or interest on borrowed funds. That is almost as much as the city collects in sales tax. Again, we will offer recommendations for short and long-term savings on these fees, some of which are predatory and have resulted in Wall Street taking money that rightfully should go to our neighborhoods. Finally, we will offer some specific roadblocks that we believe are hampering the most effective delivery of service to taxpayers. Here, too, we will offer solutions. Well, thank you for your attention. Are we gonna? Okay. Let me just start by introducing the coalition partners. Who is the Coalition of City Unions? We formed in 2006. We represent 22,000 city workers, 65% of the civilian workforce, and most importantly, despite the fact that we are labor unions, we have taken a path and a relationship that really is beyond the traditional labor management relationship. And over the course of the last 5 years, as a result of the financial collapse, drove cost savings with the city. in an unprecedented manner. I first want to take an opportunity to introduce all of the coalition partners. The building trades. Operating Engineers Local 501, represented by Gavin Coons. Teamsters Local 911, represented by Jorge Sanchez. LIUNA Local 777, represented by Victor Gordo. SCIU, represented by David Sanders. And AFSCME, I guess that's me. I want to just briefly, before we move into the rest of our presentation, cover with you again the concrete steps that the coalition unions took in an unprecedented manner. It's important to remember that city workers voluntarily voted to open their contracts twice and to engage in serious cost-saving strategies with the City of Los Angeles to the best of our extent preserve services, deal with pension and health care costs in a responsible manner. The coalition knew that a workforce reduction would probably be required as a result of the collapse of Wall Street and the impact on the tax base of the City of Los Angeles. Instead of the devastating impacts of layoffs, city workers came forward and said, let's develop a plan to encourage senior employees to voluntarily retire, and that city workers will pay for the cost of this retirement effort, the early retirement plan. As a result, city workers contributed voluntarily an additional 1% of pay to fund the early retirement program. This has resulted in this year, tracked an 18.8% contribution to the city LACER system that would not be there except for the voluntary commitment of city workers to pay for an early retirement incentive program to keep frontline, more junior workers working in communities and providing services. We also tackled, in an unprecedented way, rising health care costs. As a result of what we have done in the health care arena, by aggressively taking on plan design, by really requiring market forces to come to play to compete for the city's business, and using the leverage that the size of these contracts have in the marketplace. We have driven down health care costs in an unprecedented way. Over the last several years, we have saved in actual dollars $38.8 million. This has resulted in the lowest the lowest health care costs among all employee groups in the City of Los Angeles. The impact of retirement: we voluntarily, again, opened our contracts, agreed to increase our contribution to the retirement plans, which is among the highest in the entire state of California at this point in time. That has resulted in hard savings for the City of Los Angeles Pension Fund. This year alone, $75.3 million. These savings are real. These savings came at great sacrifice to our members, to city workers, who literally have taken out of their pocketbook to work to maintain services in the City of Los Angeles. I now want to turn over the rest of our presentation to our three research experts. First of all, Ryan Hudson, who will speak on the consequences of service cuts over the last 5 years.
I just want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to be here. It's really an honor and a privilege. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, it's been a very difficult 5 years here in the City of Los Angeles and trying to balance your budget while maintaining your services. What we did here is we quantified some of the service impacts over the last 5 years. We just wanted to quickly run through those so we could really put a perspective on what has happened to services since the recession began. So the first thing we looked at was street services and the debris removed. The city's capacity to do that has been reduced by about 61% since 2008. 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 61% In terms of clearing land in the city, I think this speaks to the priority of the mayors of having attractive and sustainable neighborhoods. The city's capacity to clear land has been reduced by 54% since 2008. The number of trees the city has trimmed since 2008 has fallen by about 46%. Intersection traffic control, which I think hits everyone here in Los Angeles to a pretty high degree trying to get around the city, has been reduced by an astounding 74% since the recession began. The city has abated about 56% less vehicles that have been abandoned. And one of my something of particular concern to me is the catch basin cleaning, which has been reduced by about 42%. I just want to make the note that the EPA does recommend that catch basins with trash be cleaned about once a week, and I think it's important, and the coalition believes it's important to be a good steward environmentally, and austerity has definitely impacted the care we give to our environment. So those were really just, I think, the dramatic reductions in services that we have seen because of austerity in the economy. And the data presented on this next slide, I think, really sums up the challenge that council has been facing. So for the 5 years leading up to the recession, the city, on average, increased spending in their governmental accounts, so special funds, general fund, and other governmental activity accounts, by about $450 million a year. Since the recession began in 2008, over the last 5 years, the city has reduced, on average, governmental spending by about $100 million a year to cope with the loss of revenues. So we've seen what the austerity has done, and we've seen why the austerity was done. Of particular concern is we want to note that the dramatic cuts to capital spending. I see a lot of cities, I bargain a lot of cities, and I have to tell you the cuts that LA City did on capital spending, which I agree were necessary, were much more dramatic than other cities. And I understand one of the priorities here is to be an attractive city to attract business. And if LA can't remain competitive with cities like Santa Monica or Pasadena or West Hollywood, there is going to be a competitive issue in the future. We do understand that capital spending has been restored this year to a pretty high degree, but again, this reflects the dramatic cuts in services and the dramatic cuts that infrastructure spending suffered. So in aggregate, it's been a pretty rough couple years, but what we've really seen through your audited financial statements is that the general fund really only ended with a deficit 1 year, and that was in 2008. The action the city took maintained the health of the general fund, but it did not maintain the health of the services. And we've seen that every year since 2009, the city's actually closed the year with a net gain to the general fund. What has that meant? That meant that the city's total cash, which I'm describing as cash available for discretionary appropriation, has steadily increased every single year since the recession began. And this really, to the coalition, represents the fact that the city has really erred on the side of austerity more than anything else, and that has dramatically affected services but has improved the health of the city's general fund. And the coalition points this out not because we're asking council to spend any more money out of the reserves this year, but we're hoping that the council will take a more balanced approach of protecting services, restoring services, while making sure the general fund is in a healthy position. So we're not asking for you to use reserves. We're simply asking that you stop temporarily putting money into reserves. We believe for the next year or two, the amount of reserves are sufficient, and we would like to see some real service restoration so Los Angeles can continue to remain competitive as a city in this region. We would briefly like to talk about a few short and long-term solutions that we would like to see the city take. The first being the blight ordinance. The coalition remains a little puzzled about why the neighborhood nuisance law and the blight laws have not been enforced. We do understand that the city attorney is currently reviewing a settlement from back east in which the federal courts ruled that banks cannot be held accountable for homes that they have not yet foreclosed on. The coalition believes, though, that they can be held accountable for the houses that they already have possession of that have already been foreclosed on. And we would like to see an ordinance that really has some teeth to address the blight in the neighborhoods. And it'd be general fund neutral, it'd be making up with fees, and it would have a really dramatic impact on our neighborhoods, we believe. The second point we want to make is about Prop 13 and property taxes. So as all of you know, property taxes are a huge source of revenue for all local governments, not just Los Angeles City. And one of the side effects of Prop 13 when it was passed in 1975 was that it really it opened a loophole to allow commercial property owners to exploit it. So their commercial properties were not assessed at market value. And that has resulted in residential property owners paying a much larger share of the total property tax bill than they ever have been, and we think that's pretty dramatic. The coalition of LA City Unions is going to be pushing for statewide reform to close this loophole. So commercial properties will be taxed at their actual value, and those properties would be reassessed to recuperate property tax revenue. We believe that just for the city of LA, that would increase property tax revenues between $129 million to about $280 million annually. That would be discretionary property tax revenue into the general fund year after year. Just for the city of Los Angeles, not to mention all the other cities in California that would also get the windfall of reform if it was adopted. I would briefly like to introduce one of our community partners, Anna Garcia. She is from the Central American Research Center, and she just wants to have a few comments on how the service cuts have impacted the community.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. As a community organization, we have daily interaction with residents, especially in the Pico Union Westlake area. And in that area specifically, there's a number of empty lots, and these lots become neglected, they become filled with trash, they become unsafe for our residents, and they're bad for the businesses around that area. And instead of these lots remaining neglected, they can be used to develop green space for the residents. They can even be used to develop affordable housing for the area residents. And we just think it sends a bad message to the area residents where so much of their community remains neglected. These residents are also Angelenos, and their needs should also be addressed in the budget. Thank you.
I would like to turn it over to Lisa Cody, who's really done some extraordinary work on Wall Street and how we could change the conversation here starting in Los Angeles City.
Good morning, Councilman. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions. When I began my research, it's not working. This was the picture that initially emerged. The city's budget and financial statements contained almost none of the fees that we were looking for. It took months to find a portion of what the city pays to Wall Street. This is a breakdown of what we know the city, together with its proprietary and fiduciary departments, paid in fees in fiscal year 12-13. A little bit over $204 million was our initial estimate. As you can see in the very last box there, we were unable to quantify what the pension funds pay in performance fees on private equity and hedge funds. Why? It turns out that no one knows, except for the private equity firms. Today we will present what we believe to be an accurate ballpark estimate of what the city pays in performance fees. Before moving on, I want to do some accounting. First, since issuing our report, we found an additional $10.1 million more in banking and processing fees, which we missed in the initial report, increasing the total to $18 million. Second, while we were aware that the treasurer invests more than $7 billion in assets, we were not able to identify in the records how much the city paid in investment management fees. So, conservatively, we didn't include that in the report. However, we know a lot more at this point. We used a conservative fee rate of 0.15% of the total assets managed to estimate the city paid about $10.5 million in fees on investments by the treasurer. Thus, the total for these fees increased to $143.6 million, as opposed to the $133 million that we initially reported. Finally, we estimated that the 3 pension funds spent more than $75 million in performance fees on private equity and hedge fund investments. So what are performance fees? Fund managers for private investments typically receive 20% of the profits after meeting an minimum investment return, the so-called hurdle, which is 8%. Because performance fees come off the top of investment returns, neither the boards nor their investment managers are aware of how much the pensions are paying in performance fees. For successful firms like this one, Apollo, performance fees are substantial, and they often dwarf what we pay in management fees. In 1 year, Apollo reported earning $2.2 billion in performance fees. That is almost 7 times more than the $321 million the firms took in management and transaction fees. To estimate what our city's pension funds pay in performance fees, we compared the total fees reported in SEC reports and other public documents for 3 major firms, Apollo, KKR, and Blackstone, which charge, respectively, 6%, 3.17%, and 2.65% of the total private investments managed. Using an average percentage of 3.94 of the total amount of private assets that our pension funds invest, which is about $3.1 billion, we estimate the city paid more than $75 million in performance fees. So as a result of finding $10.1 million more in banking and processing fees, our new estimates of the $143.6 million in investment management fees and about $76 million in performance fees, the new total that we achieved and found today was $300.4 million. And we believe there are genuine opportunities to save millions in fees in the areas I have highlighted with the investments by the Treasurer and the pension funds. So let's begin by digging deeper into the bank and processing fees. According to the city's Inspector General, or your revenues are, the city spends $18 million per year on these types of fees. Of that, 82% goes to the merchant services, and that's about $14.76 million. So according to the Office of Finance, this contract, which is a 25-year contract, is open for renegotiations in 2016. In keeping with the Inspector General's goals, we recommend that the city should begin exploring now options and releasing a new RFP to utilize any opportunities to drive down merchant services costs. We understand that the Office of Finance has reported their rates are very competitive, and that may very well be true. We are simply suggesting that the city use the RFP process to achieve the lowest possible rate. And this seems in line with the mayor's request for a report back from the Office of Finance to review credit card transactions and opportunities to renegotiate rates for parking meters. We suggest that this report back include opportunities to save money for the entire city, not just for parking meters. If we reduce the city's cost by just 1/3, we would save the city $5 million per year. And that would bring our total, starting to go down, below $300 million. Another area to explore for fee reductions and savings, is the interest rate swaps the city currently has with New York Mellon and Dexia. The city entered into these deals in 2006 when it refinanced its wastewater system revenue bonds from fixed rate bonds to variable rate bonds. They did that in order to save money and take advantage of lower interest rates. However, in order to protect themselves from spiking interest rates down the line, the city entered into swaps, agreeing to pay New York Mellon and Dexia a fixed rate of 3.34%, and the banks agreed to pay the city a variable rate that the city could then use to pay the interest on its bonds. If interest rates were projected accurately and didn't change dramatically, the payments made by the city and to the city would more or less balance out over the life of the contract, and the city would end up with something like a similar to a fixed rate bond. However, the logical question is then, what went wrong with these swaps? So the city entered into these deals expecting to save $3.5 million per year over the life of the bonds. Unfortunately, the deals soured in 2008 when the economy crashed. The bottom fell out of interest rates when the Fed intervened by cutting interest rates to near zero as a means to give banks access to cheap money. That crash and the subsequent and prolonged cuts to interest rates were unforeseeable events that radically changed the assumptions upon which these deals were based. Instead of saving money, the city finds itself locked into a fixed rate substantially above market rate. while New York Mellon and Dexia take advantage of variable interest rates kept artificially low by the Fed. As a result, New York Mellon and Dexia have been able to pocket the difference of $4.8 million per year. Since 2008, New York Mellon and Dexia have unfairly profited up to $65 million at the expense of taxpayers. This includes a $26.1 million payment that the city had to pay in 2012 to terminate a portion of these swaps. New York Mellon and Dexia want another $24 million to exit these swaps in the future. These banks are reaping a windfall at taxpayers' expense. If the city does nothing, we stand to lose another $69 million at current interest rates because we're locked into these deals until 2028. On May 2, 2014, Councilman Koretz introduced a motion that calls on Mellon and Dexia to either renegotiate with the city at no cost or for the city council to terminate business with these banks altogether if they refuse. In his words, New York Mellon Bank and Dexia need to either step up to the plate or need to be told to step away. We agree and applaud Councilman Koretz for taking a stand against Wall Street greed. In addition to the councilman's motion, we propose that the council request that the city attorney investigate whether the city has grounds to terminate or renegotiate the swaps based on new Dodd-Frank rules. If the city was able to terminate the swap with no penalty, the potential savings would include $4.8 million per year until 2028. Again, that's over $69 million. Another potential area of savings pertains to the $17.9 million that the city spends on letters of credit. Letters of credit are essentially insurance policies that would allow the city to continue to pay bills if the market for its bonds dried up, while providing assurance to bond investors that the bonds could be redeemed on demand. Currently, the banks charge the city anywhere from 29 to 125 basis points annually to provide that insurance. The city should consider asking the pension funds or other government entities to provide those letters of credit for the city's variable rate debt. Because letters of credit are insurance policies on debt, no money leaves the insurer unless the city defaults on its debt, which has never happened. If the pension funds charge the city one-third less than what they pay Wall Street now, we could save $5.9 million per year. This isn't working. And the pension funds, rather than Wall Street banks, would earn that profit. And to the credit of the CAO, they attempted to do that a few years ago without much success. So, reducing the next area I'd like to discuss is reducing management and performance fees on public and private investments held by both the treasurer and the three pension funds. Right now we're spending a large amount of money on this. We believe that the city could save tens of millions every year if the city could aggressively renegotiate with outside fund managers and the city can certainly leverage the collective assets of these three funds by sharing investment managers, something the controller has already recommended. Secondly, by aggressively by insourcing their own Wall Street talent, this would allow the city to directly invest in private equity and other alternative investments, cutting out the middleman. One example of this is a pension fund called the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund in Canada. It recruits its own Wall Street fund managers, invests directly in the market, and over the last 10 years, it's been the highest performing pension fund in the world. Its internal private equity operation costs only 0.5% of its total investments. So I realize that the size of that pension fund might not be achievable for us, but if the city's three pension funds acted in concert, we could certainly leverage the collective assets of those funds to negotiate better deals. And in fact, if the city reduced management and performance fees by just 10%, we would save $22 million per year. So in conclusion, the City of Los Angeles must fundamentally change its conversation with Wall Street. Fees are negotiable. If successful, our proposed fee reductions would save the city $33.7 million, revenue that's sorely needed to restore vital public services to Angelenos. Next, I'd like to introduce Angelina Jimenez from ACE, who will speak to you about issues related to the banks and blight in Los Angeles.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Angelina Jiménez, miembro de ACE. Vivo en la ciudad de Los Ángeles, exactamente donde está la USC.
Good morning. My name is Angelina Jimenez. I'm a member of ACE, and I live in the USC area.
Nuestra comunidad sigue impactada por la crisis. Un ejemplo son las casas abandonadas, vacías por embargos de los bancos.
Our community is still impacted by the economic crisis, and one good example of that is there's still a lot of vacant houses that are foreclosed.
Yo tengo una historia al lado de mi casa. Por 2 años yo la tuve que limpiar. La barría cada semana, porque a mí me interesa la comunidad donde yo vivo. A mí me gustaría que a toda la gente, a la ciudad sobre todo, le interesara.
I like to take an interest in the community where I live, and I hope that everybody else does as well. And I have a story about a house that was vacant next to my house that I invested 2 years of my own time cleaning up because it wasn't clean.
Esa limpieza de esa casa me han costado 2 años. Al cabo de año y medio se añadió la otra vecina que quedaba al lado del otro lado de la casa para ayudarme, porque primero me decían que estaba loca, pero después que vieron que allí no entraban malvivientes, perdón, pero pasaban muchas prostitutas queriéndose meter a la casa, y lo que yo hice fue parquear mi carro para que pensaran que la casa estaba con gente viviendo.
So at first, my neighbors thought I was crazy. They're like, "Why are you spending time cleaning up a vacant house next to your house?" But she was worried. I was worried about the safety situation. I actually saw at times prostitutes would attempt to enter the house, and so at one point my neighbor actually joined me, and then I started parking my car in the driveway so that the people would think it was occupied.
Y yo me pregunto, ¿cómo es posible que la ciudad no haya hecho su trabajo multando a los bancos por tener esas casas abandonadas y nos tenga que costar a los vecinos y a la ciudad sobre todo, que está yendo a limpiar y les está costando dinero por limpiar esas casas?
So I asked myself, why is it that the city is not implementing its own law that requires fines to banks when they leave houses in this condition, and instead I'm spending my time and money and the city is spending its own money to deal with the consequences of these properties?
Hace 4 años pasó una ley para multar a las casas, a los bancos por tener las casas abandonadas. Me gustaría saber que la ciudad me contestara a mí por qué no lo han hecho. Allí hay dinero para que arreglen las banquetas, los árboles y no nos toquen a la comunidad cobrarnos.
4 years ago, the city passed a law requiring fines for banks when they failed to maintain vacant foreclosed properties. I'd like to ask the city, why haven't you issued any fines? This would be money that would cover the cost of dealing with these problems as well as potentially money to fix the sidewalks and other things that we've heard there is no money for right now.
Otras ciudades como Oakland, Riverside, ya están colectando millones de dólares en multas a los bancos, ya están trabajando mejor.
Other cities like Oakland and Riverside have the same law. They've already collected millions of dollars in fines and are implementing their law.
Solamente me gustaría decirle a la ciudad, me gustaría que ya trabajaran en serio. Yo creo que ya es hora.
I would just like to say to the city that I think it's time to get serious about this.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Good morning, council members. It's a privilege to be here again and to speak on behalf of workers. I'm going to close us out talking about quality jobs and city efficiencies. The efficiencies will be familiar to you, so I'll move through those quickly. But I want to start off talking about a piece of the conversation in economic development that I don't think has been a thorough public conversation. If we could switch to the slides. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. So the first thing I want to say is that it's an economic development basic that the public sector is actually the largest industry in the LA metro area. It employs 25% of Angelenos. This chart is a census data chart, hard to read from the back, I'm sure, but the bottom line number is that there are 509,000 state and local government employees in the region. That makes us the biggest employer. And even Wall Street has said that job losses in the public sector have held back LA's economic recovery. The city of Los Angeles is the single largest employer in the region. And as Moody's noted in its December report card, total payrolls advanced in the region, but local government job cuts tempered those gains. Local and federal spending in payroll cuts remain a near-term risk, making Los Angeles an average performer. So the point here is that, that's not the point. The point here is that as we talk about service restoration and job creation, we need to be mindful of the fact that we are an economic engine. The city is itself an economic engine. The next thing I want to talk about, you've heard testimony from workers about our what in the city are called as-needed employees. For the public, they're basically temporary employees. They are hired for 1,000 hours or less during a year. We also have half-time employees who are hired for more than 1,000 hours, but less than full-time. What I'm going to call temp workers, the as-neededs, they experience exploitation because they're moved on and off payroll to keep them at 1,000 hours. We're not saying, and as you can see in this slide, we're not saying that all as-needed employees, temp employees, are inappropriately used or abused. We were pleased to see the Animal Services Department implement the licensing canvas program this year with as-needed employees, so that's a thumbs up. The exploitation we're seeing, though, the Building and Safety Department spending over $1 million creating a temporary clerk pool when there is a consistent need for service delivery, that's a thumbs down for us. Trash truck drivers on temporary rather than even half-time work, you heard testimony about how they can't have consistent routes, and that impacts service delivery. The crossing guards, we're all familiar with the tragic story of a mother being run down in a street that was supposed to have crossing guards. And I know that council has already asked for a report back on the crossing guards, which we very much appreciate. It's a serious situation, and those workers deserve to be half-time and have dignity in the civil service system. And then lastly, parking enforcement. You've heard from SEIU in previous years, and you'll hear from our members again during the hearings, about how using part-timers for parking enforcement creates a major problem. You saw Ryan's data earlier on intersection control. The part-timers who are exclusively being used for giving tickets, they don't have the flexibility to do intersection control, and there are major issues around that whole program. This is an Art Sweatman photograph from the field, and we want to talk a little bit about insourcing work. The budget has, and you've already discussed this, $4 million slated for contract work to fix our trees. We were delighted to hear discussion that there'll be consideration of making that $4 million go to full-time tree trimming services. The city at this point has one crew of permanent tree trimmers, and that's a problem for many reasons. One, obviously, the work can't get done, but two, city workers are institutional memory holders for service delivery, and if you abolish the core function of a department in tree trimming, you're not going to be able to regulate contractors properly even. The same is true with sidewalks. We're pleased to see that there's $20 million in the UB to start sidewalk restoration, and we look forward to continuing conversations about executing that work with city workers. Okay. Civilianization, we had a discussion in council. You heard from our clerks. There's been a depletion of critical civilian staff. Here you see what's happened with administrative class, staff, clerks, clerk typists, senior clerk typists, severe drop since the Wall Street crash. And the same is true with 911 operators. And the concern is that we need to be sure that the right worker is doing the right job. And I know you've ordered department report backs on that issue as well. And along with that, jail civilianization, making sure the right worker is doing the right job. We heard testimony, and it's a little scary to talk against the chief, but I will say that in looking at the budgeted cost for a detention officer, he testified that it is cheaper to use a sworn officer coming out of the academy than it is to use a civilian detention officer, and we don't really understand that. I did look at the LAPD hiring websites, notice their starting salaries are very different from what is actually budgeted in the budget book for a starting salary. So this is an area of continuing concern. Workers' compensation savings, one of our favorite topics. We talked about this last year. We think that you can zero out the $4 million that's allocated in the budget, maybe not this year, but in the future. The $4 million is for litigation costs on workers' comp. As you know, SEIU has a program that it piloted several years ago as part of worker efficiency proposals that actually came out in 2004 to create an alternative dispute resolution process. So there's a joint labor management process where we're making sure that workers get healthy and get back to work quickly because the workers' comp system itself isn't really set up to do that. It's about insurance and liability. It's not about healthy bodies, unfortunately. So we would like to work with the city to have a healthier workforce and save the city money. The last issue I'm going to talk about is managed hiring. This chart, which is hard to read on screen, I can't even see it, so I have to pull it up myself. We made a Public Records Act request to the Bureau of Street Services to take a look at positions that they have requested during the year. This is in the paper report that we gave you as well on page
54, but it's not.
Page 38, if that's easier for you to look at. And what we saw was, although the Bureau of Street Services is 75% special funded, positions are not being moved quickly through managed hiring. And, you know, we saw a safety engineer sitting there since May of 2011. I don't know why that is, but it's kind of disturbing. And we don't blame the CIO for this. The CIO is in charge of administering it, and I'm sure it's no fun at all. We know they're subject to it as well. But we were pleased to hear the CIO talk about moving towards a blanket unfreeze of managed hiring positions after the budget is passed. And what that would do would be to let departments live within their means. They would obviously not be able to run out and hire all the vacancies because they've calculated salary savings into their budget, but it would speed up hiring where they do have the money. And that's what we need to do to restore services. So, in summary, we just want to say thank you for listening to our observations. And I would like to introduce a research colleague, Laura Marita from Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education, SCOPE, to close us out.
Thank you. Yes, as she said, I'm with SCOPE, and also we're a member of Fix LA. And SCOPE is a community-based and membership-based organization that's been in South LA for the past 20 years. And so I wanted to talk a little bit just about how cuts to programs such as workforce development and also cuts to city jobs have affected our neighborhoods. And as you all probably know, South LA has a disproportionately high rate of unemployment and underemployment. And private investment really hasn't been the solution for economic growth or for job growth in South LA. You can look at sales and business tax revenue for the districts in South LA and see that there just aren't opportunities to spend money or to do business or really places of employment. And many of our members and community members are employed in service and retail industry jobs that are part-time and low wage. And so historically, public jobs and city jobs have been really an opportunity for a career path job for both low-income communities and communities of color. And so we realize it's in the interest of all community members to invest in workforce development and economic growth, and that just economic inequality is unsustainable for the city as a whole. So we'd like to see more investment in good jobs and job creation throughout the city. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk about our priorities and recommendations with you.
All right, thank you all very, very much. I'm very pleased that we've started this process of engaging our labor partners during the budget and finance hearings. It's always, I think, tremendously helpful for us to have the benefit of many different perspectives and the extensive resources that you bring to bear in this process as well. So I want to thank you very much for that. As the mayor pointed out in his State of the City address, very often the people who are actually doing the work of running the city, who are actually in the trenches doing the work, are the ones who have the best suggestions for how to create efficiencies and do it better, more effectively, and cheaper. And the mayor has been highlighting some of those examples, but I think on an ongoing basis, we gain tremendously by engaging the people who are doing the work. And so for that, I want to thank you all very much. I'm going to start with a few questions of my own, if I may, and I know we're going to ask for a lot of reports back, probably based on some of these findings. The blight reduction fines on financial institution-owned real estate has honestly bothered me as well since we enacted that. And I know it's more complex than simply saying go out and enforce it. But I don't understand why we have done so little to try to take advantage of the opportunities that presents itself. This should be a win-win. It's at least cost neutral and probably cost positive at the end of the day. It helps relieve blight in our neighborhoods. I can't understand why we wouldn't be more aggressively pursuing this. So I'd like to ask for a report back on both the status of blight reduction fines, what the resources that would be necessary in order to have a robust blight reduction program based on the council's ordinance imposing that fine regimen would be, and the costs and potential benefits of immediate implementation of it. And I'd like that to be a budget impact report so we can consider doing it in this fiscal year. I appreciate the analysis that you did on Prop 13's, I think, unintended consequence of shifting the property tax burden in California away from corporate property owners and onto the backs of residential homeowners. And I think that my constituents in the Valley, who were largely responsible for Proposition 13's enactment, may have felt differently about it at the time had they known that they were essentially going to be subsidizing Walmart and other large corporate landowners. I think this senior living on a fixed income in a home in the Valley that they've lived in for a long time would find that to be a surprise. But in fact, that is what has happened. It's clear as it can be that the property tax burden, first of all, has been suppressed compared to almost every place else in the country, but worse when it comes to homeowners. It's shifted the burden onto their backs and away from businesses, and it just seems unfair. That being said, clearly it's important to identify the issue. It's obviously nothing that we have the slightest bit of power to deal with. This is the terrain that we're forced to operate on as a local government, and I'm bothered when we make when some people out there make comparisons, for example, of the cost of doing business in California or the tax burden and so on. They always conveniently neglect to mention the property tax component of that. It takes somebody like Warren Buffett sometimes to stand up and tell our governor, our then governor, that it just doesn't make any sense. There's one of the richest guys in the country saying you should have a higher burden of property tax in order to be able to offset other tax burdens. So anyway, just a little soapboxy here, but that I appreciate you raising the issue. But it also is an issue that impacts our ability to increase revenues to meet our basic needs. We don't have that ability since Prop 13 and its successor initiatives. We don't have the ability to do that. With regard to bank fees, I'd like to get a report back on the fees that are paid on city funds for investment and management of city funds responsive to the coalition's report. But with regard particularly to the pension fund fees, again, this is something, the pension funds are managed by independent pension boards. Deliberately, they are not within the control of the city council or the mayor, and with good reason. It is important that they retain their independence. But I would like to request that the pension boards consider fee reduction strategies and respond to the coalition's particular concerns and report back to this committee. And frankly, I would urge the coalition to do so as well, because it's your members who are owed the fiduciary duty by those boards. It's not the city, it's your members. And so you should be the ones who are going to the boards and influencing the boards to act on this. So I would urge you to do so. With regard to credit card processing, I'd like to get a report back on the costs, benefits of a potential RFP, a new RFP for the credit card processing contractor. What are the potential benefits, but also what are the cost of doing the RFP itself, and is it justified by the potential savings? I'd also like to know how much of that credit card processing cost is offset by charges to the cardholder. So are we maximizing our ability to create convenience fees and so on when credit card payments are made? With regard to the swaps issue, Mr. Koretz is already pursuing that on the legislative front, and I'm sure that will proceed apace on the legislative front outside of the normal budget process of this committee. But I do think it would be helpful to have a city attorney opinion on the possibility of terminating or renegotiating the swaps based on new Dodd-Frank rules, if that, in fact, provides a basis for doing so. I just don't know, but I think it would be helpful at least to have a city attorney opinion to that effect. So you mentioned the attempt a few years ago to ask the pension funds to issue letters of credit, which on its face seems like a logical idea, but that did not meet with success. What was the reason that it did not meet with success?
I think in order to understand that fully, you'd have to ask Ms. Brill, because she had the idea to do it in the first place, but my understanding of why that was refused or not considered was that they have a fiduciary responsibility, and somehow they wouldn't be getting a return of 7.75% on their investment. And I know that that issue was raised in the first day of the hearings, and I don't know if there's a misunderstanding in terms of what a letter of credit is, but it's not an actual issuance of debt, and unless, of course, the city defaults, which has never happened. In fact, we just got through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and we still didn't default. So it's an insurance policy, and my understanding, again, is that was what was said to the CAO's office, that they need to get a certain return on their investment. Therefore, because we'd be asking for, beating the bank deal or even getting the same deal, that somehow they couldn't provide those. So I don't know if there's just a misunderstanding about what they are.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you that the risk of default is extraordinarily slight, and as you say, it's never happened. Yeah. But I think for any financial institution, whatever that risk is, it has to be measured in some way, and that's why they get a return on their investment, to account for the risk and then also to make a profit. And if it is a pension fund with a fiduciary obligation for the long term to members, I can see that they might not want to go into an entirely new venture involving risk. Still, if that risk can be minimized and a return can be had that benefits pension funds rather than outside entities, it seems to me that that would be something that's definitely worth pursuing. So let's have a report back, please, on the historical attempts to do so and how we might be able to pursue a different course in order to make that a more palatable option for the pension funds. Again, this is going to be left up to the trustees of the pension funds. It's not up to us. But I think at least if we can package an offer in a way that might be more attractive to them, it should, again, be a win-win. It's better for the pension funds. It's less cost for the city, and if we are going to incur costs, at least it's staying in the family by helping us to offset some of our longer-term unfunded pension obligations. So it should work out to the benefit of all. I don't know if we asked this when transportation was here. Mr. Bonin, maybe you remember, but since we are budgeting for so many part-time parking enforcement officers, I'm wondering if there might be, if they can be cross-trained to do intersection control as well, so that if they were full-time employees and they weren't assigned to parking enforcement, whether they would be surge capacity for dealing with with intersection control as well. I don't know if you know that offhand or if we requested that.
That was certainly the intent of one of my report backs. If it's not clear, where it should be.
Okay.
It was both to look at whether having the part-time would increase the capacity of the full-time to do traffic enforcement, but it was also, can they be trained to do traffic enforcement the half-time?
Okay,
Yeah.
great. We got that one covered then. And then finally for me, I love the idea of exploring new alternative dispute resolution processes for workers' comp and probably more. We must do more to reduce our litigation expense in this city. And our current city attorney has already taken the bull by the horns and is doing a great job when it comes to risk management analysis and bringing more litigation in-house into the city attorney's office. I think he sees the importance of this, and he's working very, very diligently to do that. The workers' comp cost to me just seems like low-hanging fruit, and it's an ideal place to work in partnership with our labor organizations to find creative solutions. So you have a report on that, I believe, on the ADR proposal. Have you met with the city attorney with regard to that yet?
I'm not aware of any conversations, but I don't know if David.
Okay. All right. So I think not sure quite how to pursue that. I guess what I would suggest is that the first step would probably be for you to meet with the city attorney on it.
Okay.
And then if that is a fruitful conversation, then we can further consider it here. But it seems like it's more in his ballpark than ours right now. But I'm very interested in pursuing this because we must reduce these workers' comp costs, including litigation costs. All right. Members, Mr. Kretz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of comments on some things you already said. I think it is critical to reform Prop 13, and while we don't have any direct involvement, I don't believe the City of LA has, in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, taken a position formally urging that we close these loopholes and that we deal with the business side of Prop 13. And I don't think it was an unintended consequence. I think Prop 13 was written with one purpose in mind, which was to devastate government's ability to function. It was an unintended consequence for the voters who thought they were just giving themselves property tax relief. But I think this absolutely was envisioned, and it's time that we address it. The businesses at the time weren't even asking for this relief. It was purely residential that were in trouble. And there were even major business owners that were opposed to it because they could see what was going on. So I think the time has come to do this. I think this is one of the biggest opportunities in government to gain some revenue by correcting a long-time ill. Letters of credit, unless we're all misunderstanding exactly what they do, there is as close to zero risk as could be. And it's essentially free money both for the city and for the pension systems if we move this out of Wall Street. I think unless, again, we're misunderstanding how these works, this should be an absolute top priority and a no-brainer. On workers' comp, and I guess this is a question for the CAO, I know there are also some pretty effective workers' comp expense reduction consultants that are out there, and there are a couple that have been pretty successful. I don't know if we have looked at that as well. But I remember looking at this at the state level, and there are some folks that have been very effective at coming into municipalities and states and finding ways to reduce costs. So I'd suggest we give a look at that as well.
All right, thank you very much. Before we go to our next member, I do just want to take a moment to recognize the presence here today of our former colleague, the Honorable Greg Smith. Welcome, Greg. It's good to have you back. Bet you're sorry you left. Mr. Bonin.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, you are clearly a glutton for punishment. I didn't think you would come back to another round of budget hearings. I want to start by saying thank you. I want to, well, before I even thank you, let me thank Mr. Krikorian for doing this again this year, because there were a number of years in the midst of the worst of the crisis when this was necessary and it didn't happen. And I want to thank you for your leadership over the past few years of doing this. And I want to thank you for doing this, for the reports over the past few years, and for this one in particular, and for the fact that you've broadened out the coalition to include Fix LA and the other partners who are here with you today. You know, there was a dispute we all heard about a concert in the park that's coming up this summer. And at the press conference announcing it, Gloria Molina said, Los Angeles has 99 problems, and one of them is not Jay-Z. Los Angeles has 99 problems, and one of them is not that we lack a smart and willing cooperative labor partner. One of them is not that we have labor leaders and city employees who are forward-thinking and looking for problem solving. I'm impressed by the hard work that you've put into this, and I'm impressed by sort of the progressive vision behind it. So I just want to start by applauding that and endorse much of what's in here. On the blight ordinance, Mr. Krikorian sort of covered most of the directions in the report backs. On the blight ordinance, though, when we do the report back on that, though, I'd like us to include a look at what Oakland and some of the other cities that have been collecting have been doing. You know, so often we exist in a vacuum of Los Angeles, and we don't look beyond to see what other cities, particularly in California, are doing, because whatever law may be holding us back here in Los Angeles is no different for Oakland or for another city. So I'd like us to specifically look at that. But I wanted to ask you on that, do you think that our problem in collecting the revenue from the blighted properties from the banks is that our ordinance is not being enforced, or that our ordinance needs to be revised in some ways, to be tightened?
The budget documents state that the ordinance hasn't been brought to this body for adoption. And so that's been the holdup. And so we're requesting that the ordinance be, that the council would direct immediately, request of the city attorney that the ordinance come back expeditiously so that implementation can begin. Ted, did you want to?
My name's Ted Rorlick. I'm with SEIU Research. The original ordinance was passed in 2010, and the history very simply is that it exempted most of the banks from even having to register their properties because it said that they could rely on a private database. That has been corrected, right, but there has been no enforcement capacity at building and safety because the council assigned enforcement to building and safety, but the collection of the money went to the housing department for registration fees.
So it's both a either legal reticence or legal confusion and a lack of appropriate staffing?
I think it's a lack of appropriate staff. The council approved 6 additional positions, I believe it was last year, for building and safety, but the chair is correct that that there was another ordinance, an enforcement ordinance passed, and that has not come back from the city attorney. Our understanding is that the city attorney is believes that that there's this federal court ruling in Chicago that cripples enforcement. At least that's what we're told secondhand. And we don't believe that's an accurate interpretation of the federal court ruling.
But that's why I'd particularly like us to look at Oakland, because whatever laws that or federal ruling that we're bound by, Oakland would be bound by. So
right. If I can just clarify that for you, it's the court decided this on a federal preemption issue that was specifically directed at the law that Congress passed empowering a conservator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which enforce about half the mortgages in the country. And It addressed only the question of whether Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's conservator could be ordered to correct nuisances on properties on which it was foreclosing, but not on which it had successfully completed a foreclosure. So we're talking about, assuming that same fraction would apply to LA, we're talking about half of the mortgages that were involved in foreclosure proceedings, but not necessarily any that were involved in completed foreclosures.
Thank you. On the Prop 13 issue, there's not much I can add to what Mr. Koretz or Mr. Krikorian said. I think most of us around here are in agreement about the need to fix the loopholes in Prop 13. There's one thing I do want to add, though, because there's an impact of Prop 13. When we talk about unintended consequences, one of the unintended consequences that I see of Prop 13, and people may not make this connection right away, is traffic. Because of Prop 13, local governments have had to rely more and more on sales tax. So instead of building housing, needed housing, and increasing our inventory of housing, affordable and non-affordable, they have relied more on sales tax. As a result, we have urban sprawl. As a result, we have a horrible jobs housing imbalance that you can see on any map of traffic patterns on the west side. And there's a lot of causes for traffic, but Prop 13 and the way it has perverted local revenue gathering is a partial cause for that. And I don't think we talk about that enough because it's so you got to take a few steps to get it, but it's, in my mind, absolutely true. A question on the worker comp dispute resolution. I love that we may move towards that. Is it possible to get, I guess, like from the CAO, that cost-benefit analysis of whether or not it's worth doing back in time so that we could direct that city staff begin working on that process with labor as part of Exhibit H? Yes? That's great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenfield.
Okay, thank you. I want to echo some of the comments of my colleagues and just greatly appreciate the fact that you've come forward with a lot of really creative ideas. It's what we've been asking for a lot in this budget process, is to think outside of the box, look at the fees, look at the swaps. I love the idea of ratcheting down, any sort of fees or swaps that we can, and would call for all the report backs that my colleagues have already called for, but they've already called for them. So I want to just echo that piece of it. On the foreclosure issue, I've worked with ACE. In fact, I had a bill, AB 935, and you guys came up to testify on that in Sacramento. We got killed on that, but we brought out some of those issues together. And one of the things, we learned a couple of things from that process, though, too, and which we can bear. The hard part was getting the people who own the paper and the service loan providers are very much related, but they're distinct groups. And that was one of the things that made it very difficult to enforce. But I don't understand as a city why, as we've talked about, if we have this on the books, we can't go after the nuisance issues. And it sounds like one of the issues is about aligning the costs and the benefits, so that I want to add to the report back a look at the alignment to see if we can't capture some of the savings to put it right back into the enforcement, so that we have, we can build in this nuisance abatement costs and going after the foreclosed homes, and then use that money to fund the very positions that are doing it. So it shouldn't be a question of not having them, having and building a safety and not having them funded just because the money is going somewhere else. We need to figure out how to align that properly. The Prop 13 stuff, I would also, and maybe there's a piece here for the city, I don't know, but we should look into it. In addition to the issue of split roll, there's also the issue of when is a property transferred. And this has always been an issue that businesses, unlike homeowners, they don't die. They oftentimes, when they want to sell their property, instead of selling their property, they sell, claims in a holding company. They claim stock in a holding company. And you can have a property that, by all common sense definitions, has changed hands 10 different times, on paper has never changed hands. And that's, the split roll issue is a big one, and it's a tough nut to crack, but I think we might have a better chance at cracking the inappropriate transfer of property. And there may be a role in the city process, and I don't know, and I want to get a report back from, CAO or CLA on whether or not we can have any influence over what constitutes a transfer of property. Because if we could even get at that issue, we could prevent a lot of the inappropriate transfers of ownership that really the basis should have been rebased for those properties, and that could be a way to do it. The one thing I didn't hear in the presentation that I thought was good in your the Fix LA previous report, I don't know what to call it, was the part about you had something in there about Inspector General locating tens of millions of dollars unclaimed federal grants dating back to the Northridge earthquake. That piqued my attention because I was so involved in the earthquake, not causing the earthquake, but helping the recovery of it. Yeah. No, I'm not a fracker. Anyway. So I'd like to get a report back too on that issue that you all raised, which I thought is a good one. Specifically the Northridge earthquake. If there's money left there, I want to know about it. I spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears getting that federal money working, and if there's money out there, we need to get it. But also a report back on what else is uncollected, and ask the Inspector General for a report back on these uncollected funds. My fear is, and I've seen this happen before I was a council member, looking at different grants, city grants that come and go, that we win through a process and we never collect them, and then they disappear. Most federal grants don't have an infinite life expectancy. It's very hard to, in fact, having been on the other end of that on the federal side, in order to give a grant a life expectancy, you actually have to write it into the statute. And there are a few that are like that, but most of them aren't. So I'd like us to get a report back on what uncollected grants or funds are out there and what process we can put in place to capture them, because that's another one of those no-brainers. If it's money to be collected that's owed to us, we should be going after it. I think that's it for the issues. The loan service issue as well was also, I want to understand that better, how we can get the pensions. I asked that very question similar to the when the pension folks were here, and they did say that part about the rate of return, that they expect a certain 7.5 or 10% rate of return, and the way it's structured currently, this doesn't yield that. But maybe that we're not thinking about it in the proper way. I mean, it's more about having a co-signer on a loan than it is having an investment. And if we could somehow rejigger that so that it's not framed as an investment, and you wanted to comment on that.
On that note, the whole idea here, the banks even get money when, so that the city says they're going to issue, let's say, $300 million in commercial paper, and then it only issues $200 million. The banks actually receive money, even so they're providing letters of credit for the unused part of that debt. So in other words, the debt hasn't even been issued, and we're paying them for $100 million, some fee times $100 million or 100, whatever so we're talking about getting money here on debt that's not even issued. Right. So we could even modify it and say, okay, let's only provide for the unused, and so that's what a commitment fee is. So that it's very it is more like a co-signing a loan, and so I think that I'm not sure that I certainly think the fiduciary issue has to be investigated, because I'm not sure that's an issue.
And then the other aspect, the pensions are one, but perhaps there's a way the federal government could help us out in terms of backstopping. Correct. I was looking into this very issue when it came to our transportation money on the state side, that we were paying all this money, this money in interest, and we weren't about to default. If we got the feds, instead of giving us the money that they give us on certain federal programs, instead to basically back that loan. Right. it was a win-win. And there may be a scenario like that either with the state or the federal government.
North Dakota does this. So North Dakota has its own state bank, and they provide all the letters of credit. And actually, they're the one sort of government that sort of came through the financial crisis fairly sound, because they had such reasonable rates for a lot of their municipalities on their loans and on their debt. So there's models out there for it.
We ought to look into then
State bank.
A state bank. And I know that there's Ben Hueso and some other folks had proposals in the state legislature for such a state bank.
Yeah.
But to put onto the city agenda, at least looking into ways either through a state bank or through some other mechanism to get the state to back us, and this should be part of our legislative program because it could save us a lot of money without any cost.
Right.
Thank you very much again.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Englander.
Great, thank you. And I'll be brief. I think mostly everything was covered that I had in my notes, but before I go into any of my questions, to the coalition, you've been thanked for stepping up to the table time and time again, and particularly during these budget deliberations and putting together, he speaks for all of us. But there's somebody else that I also want to thank. I think everybody's already done that, and that's the chair of the committee. Because prior to Paul Krikorian chairing this committee, it had never happened in the history of the city during these budget deliberations where you all had a regular seat at the table for these kinds of discussions. He didn't just do it once. It's been, and it now will be embedded into the regular practice. As it should be, along with the budget advocates who are going to be, I believe, up next, is so critically important to hear from the stakeholders, to hear from our staff, to hear from the general public, to hear all the input. And so I wanted to really single him out because we always single you out and thank you for putting these reports together and digging deep. Some of the ideas that you come up with are so critically important and all taken very seriously and acted on. And they've already, if you look back, have accounted for tens of millions of not just efficiencies, money, dollars coming back into services. So I applaud you as well. One of the things you'd mentioned that I want to report back on is you mentioned the LAPD website has a different starting salary than what we have listed in the budget. I want an immediate budgetary impact report back on that. Also on your slide on the detention officers versus police officers, there's a conflict between what you had stated and what the chief stated. So I want to report back so we can get